Hello, welcome to the first episode of a podcast that I am calling The Pastor's Sawdust. And my name is Nick Powell. I'm the pastor of Hope City Church in Clinton, Iowa, and I'm in my attic here. It's going to be blazing hot later today, so I'm up here early in the morning before my fam gets up. And the reason why I want to do this podcast is because as a pastor, I read quite a bit of stuff. And a lot of the stuff that I read doesn't make its way into a sermon on Sunday morning. So what I think is valuable or could be valuable for you is if I get on here and I talk about some of the things that I'm reading as it relates to my job as a pastor. So the whole, the name, The Pastor's Sawdust, is just a metaphor you can think of. I'm sawing on my material, whether it's a commentary or whether it's the Bible or a book related to the topic that I'm preaching on. I'm sawing through that material, and there's dust that's going to fall off, that's going to get on the table. And I just want to show you some of that sawdust, and hopefully you'll be encouraged and inspired by some of the content, some of the good truth that is in the reading material that I read. And then also, so not just related to preaching, or let me back up. There's 3 sections that I want to go through, essentially, each podcast. And first section, of course, is preaching. I want to give you just a little bit more of an insight into some of the things that I'm wrestling with and some of the things that I find interesting in the text of Scripture that I'm in, but also things, like I said, that don't make their way into the sermon. I can just talk a little bit more freely about some of the things that are maybe rabbit trails or could get rabbit traily on Sunday morning. But I'm going to talk about that here. And then, so there's preaching. And then also I have the privilege to tutor and teach high school aged kids, young adults. And I do that in our homeschool group called, which is through Classical Conversations. So if you know anything about Classical Conversations or classical curriculums, they have tremendous amounts of reading assigned to these students. And I'm trying to keep pace with them, which requires me to read a lot of stuff. And so I want to bring in some things I find interesting from the reading that I'm doing to prep for tutoring those young adults. And then also, this year I'm trying something new. I'm teaching my own class that I put together on apologetics. And so I'd like to bring in some of the insights that I've gleaned, stuff that I'm learning from prepping for that class. So first section, preaching. Second section is stuff that I'm gleaning from my studies, prepping for teaching, tutoring. And then third section, I want to end every podcast with a tool of the week section. One of my biggest passions in life, aside from the Bible, is hand tool woodworking. I just love old tools. Old tools, using old tools, appreciating old tools. There's stories behind old tools. There's just something about holding a tool that multiple generations of men have held these handles and these knobs, and you can tell, like, there's a patina to them. They feel good in your hand. Tools, I have a big passion for hand tools, and so I want to kind of think of it as a tool of the week. I'm going to bring in and show you one of my favorite tools in my wood shop. So preaching, let's start there. So I'm reading preaching through the book of Exodus. And one of the things that I found interesting about the book of Exodus is you see that it carries over the story of Exodus. It carries straight over from Genesis, like it's a sequel. They're connected together. And if you have read the book of Genesis, you will remember that the family of Abraham, that he's founding a new nation that's going to redeem and save the world. And this is the family of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob has children. One of those children is Joseph. And Joseph, you're familiar with the story, Joseph gets, he's hated by his brothers. These brothers are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel. But these brothers hate Joseph and they sell him into slavery. And he ends up making his way to Egypt, getting sold into the slave trade and makes his way into Egypt and goes from slave to second in command over all of Egypt, just second to Pharaoh. And there's this interesting transition where God's people, so the family of Abraham, God's people go from being shown incredible hospitality. They're given a land, a part of Egypt called Goshen. They're able to stay there, raise families there, live there, basically free and unharassed. And because Joseph, a family member of theirs, is second in command, there's a ton of favor towards God's people. Well, if you're familiar with the story, Exodus 1 really shows you the shift in attitude of the Egyptians towards God's people. And this shift from hospitality to outright hostility is a archetypal pattern. It's a pattern that you can see all throughout Scripture, but also in church history. You see that a culture that is hospitable to God's people won't necessarily stay hospitable to God's people. And there oftentimes there will be a cultural drift towards hostility, towards those who follow God. Because, as we know, one of the things that we see is that cultures are always religious. So there's always a god that cultures worship, whether that's the god of Moloch or Baal, or the pantheon of gods that the Romans worshipped or the Greeks worshipped. But every culture is inherently religious, in that every culture is organized around that which they find to be most true, what they perceive to be good and beautiful. And so the Egyptian culture is a polytheistic, idolatrous culture. And we know from reading Genesis 1 through 3 that God has created the world, the whole world, and any person or thing that is not glorifying the Lord is not in a right relationship with the Lord. And so people are either in conformity to God's design and living in conformity to how God has wired the world and are bringing God glory, or they are out of step with God's design and they are they're hostile to God. So there's this idea of no neutrality. There's no neutrality in the world. There's not like international waters somewhere where people can just live however they want, and God's like, yo, that's so cool. That's fine. I just let you do that. There's no neutrality. And so we have this Egyptian culture that it's only a matter of time before they start persecuting God's people, because they're organized around different ultimates. They find they worship other gods. And we know from the Ten Commandments that God says that you shall have no other gods before me. So there's this collision course that's inevitable whenever God's people are in a culture that is worshiping a different God, that is organized around a different cultus. It's only a matter of time before those things collide, because they're antithetical. Anti-Christ, anti-God cultures are always going to end up clashing with Christ-centered cultures. And so you see that in Exodus 1. You see in this first little section, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter, with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And all the work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So there is this progression of, you had Joseph being regarded by the previous Pharaoh. He's seen positively. And then a new Pharaoh arose. This is what we find in Exodus 1, the very beginning. And he knew not Joseph. And so there's this distancing relationally between God's people and the leadership of the Egyptian culture. And then this distancing turns into outright fear. So disassociation, distancing from God's people, then transitions to fear and anxiety around God's people because God's people are multiplying. So there's fruitfulness there in the culture of God's people. And the Egyptian leadership sees that as a threat to their cultural dominance, their existence. They see the Hebrew people as a threat. They could join their enemies, so they're scared, and they sow seeds of fear into their people. So they start this propaganda campaign where they are painting the Hebrews as the enemy. So you see a culture, here's the pattern, is that a culture that is not a believing culture can go from being hospitable to God's people to then disassociating and distancing itself from God's people. And then fearing, anxiety, and propaganda, sowing seeds of fear, but also trying to change the perception of the entire culture and demonizing God's people because you're trying to other them and make them the enemy so that you can expel them or minimize their influence. And then the last stage is outright hostility and cruelty. And I think it's pretty obvious what stage we're in as a culture. If you are, if you're on the internet or you listen to the news or if you live in a bigger city. But for the most part, we're past the stage of hospitality. So the cultural elites in our culture, in our American culture, they have shifted from being hospitable to Christianity. Say, yeah, it's great. Let's get people who are devout, Bible-believing Christians into places of significant leadership in our culture. We've moved from that to a place where there's distancing. It's like, I don't really know. I don't really know about these conservative, Bible-believing Christians. They're kind of radical. I don't know about this. We move past that distancing to propaganda, where if you read, I don't know who reads The Guardian, but there's newspapers out there like USA Today, The Guardian, or if you go to any liberal, progressive city center, you will find there's a lot of messaging and there's a lot of painting Christians as the problem. So like any campus, college campus, is going to have a significant population of people that think conservative, Bible-based Christianity is the problem. Because, for example, like let's take abortion. Abortion is a huge issue that gets platformed, is on the forefront, and rightly so, because it shows where the worldviews are colliding. The pro-abortion movement views abortion as healthcare. And so that's a propaganda strategy where healthcare is a euphemism and it's covering up what's actually happening, which is the murder of the unborn human. And so you have this propaganda shifting of language and saying abortion is healthcare and healthcare is a human right. And so what we need is to make abortion access just available for as many people as possible. And this is going to help liberate women specifically. And it's going to give them access to healthcare, which is, of course, a human right. And this is a social good. And so we want to make abortion as available and accessible as possible. Now, Christians come into that and they go, no, abortion is murder. And we cannot, in good conscience, watch this happen in our society, in our culture that we live in. We cannot be okay with being bystanders to the murder of the unborn. And so you're looking at this, and you have Christians that are operating out of a biblical worldview, and they're saying, no, we're not going to vote for candidates that advocate for abortion and that make laws that allow for abortion, that take taxpayer money and put it towards abortion. We're not going to be okay with that. And so there's campaigns and lobbying and efforts against abortion and against abortion legislation. And they're primarily animated and energized by a Christian worldview. So the secular left, or just the pro-abortion folks, what they do, and this is where I'm getting from Exodus, is that they shift from being, well, Christians are okay. We don't really care about Christianity per se, but they're okay. They're at least doing some good things. They shift from that to outright hostility, where they'll say Christians hate women. Conservative Bible-believing Christians are bigots, and they want to keep women back and rewind women and women's rights back 100 years, 200 years. And so there's this propaganda campaign that if you were to come out as a Bible-believing Christian in public, you know that you're probably going to get smeared by somebody and say, no, this person hates women, because they're trying to deny access to essential healthcare services such as abortion. And only somebody that is a monster would want to deny healthcare to women. And so it's a redefinition of terms in order to demonize Bible-believing conservative Christians, to gag them, to shut them up, and to resist their influence. So again, distancing, propaganda, and then, of course, propaganda doesn't work to fully cover the truth, because as Jesus taught, whatever is in the darkness will come to light. The truth will end up coming out. What's whispered behind closed doors will always end up being shouted from the housetops. And so you have truth that will always make its way forward in a culture. And Christians, when operating from a biblical basis, are preaching and teaching the truth. So there's no silencing it. You cannot stop the truth from going forward. And this infuriates, it enrages the secular culture that we live in, the secular humanistic culture that is organized around man, that's organized around comfort and technology and all these other things, that wants to distance itself from God. You can't get away from the fact that the Bible teaches true things, and self-evidently true things, like murdering the unborn is wrong. For example, when you show an ultrasound picture, video to a young mother, the statistics are crazy that the young mother will not abort their baby, the majority of them, after they see the ultrasound. So there's something self-evident about, once you know that this is a human being in your womb, you don't take the life of that human being. This is a baby that deserves to be delivered and deserves to have dignity and seen as valuable. So you have the culture shifting in America, like in our own culture, shifting to becoming more and more hostile to Christianity. And that's because the culture is no longer nominally Christian. So what I mean by nominally Christian is just by name only. There's a guy named Aaron Renn, and his article gets quoted all the time by people who are interested in this kind of stuff. There's an article by Aaron Renn, and Aaron Renn essentially makes the claim that we live in a negative world, that Christianity was perceived to be a positive good for our culture, and then it shifted to being seen as sort of neutral. The culture was ambivalent towards Christianity. And then we live, what he says now, we live in a negative world where the cultural elite in our society, they view Christianity as a net negative. You're going to get socially reprimanded for being a conservative Christian. You're going to get censored. You're going to get made fun of. You're going to get opposed, So it's a net negative. So all that to say is, when I'm reading Exodus, it reminds me that there's nothing new under the sun. And we should expect, as Bible-believing Christians, even those of us living in Clinton, Iowa, in the Midwest, which is generally conservative, there's less, progressive campus, big city culture in Clinton. But we have to understand that we live in a world that is shifting away from biblical Christianity. Now, there's pockets and areas of our culture that we're seeing a resurgence in biblical Christianity. You see, the rise of some conservative pastors gaining popularity, and you see conservative Christian voices getting platformed and all that kind of stuff. But by and large, you don't have this mass revival and movement back into the church. The churches in our community are not filling up left and right. And so there is something in our culture that seems to be poisoning the well, so to speak, that seems to be like bad leaven, leavening the lump. And as Christians, we should not be surprised by that we're going to that standing on our Bible is going to be unpopular with a lot of those who are in positions of influence in the culture. We shouldn't be surprised that even our own city council in Clinton is probably not going to invite Bible-believing pastors to come speak at city council meetings as it regards to hot topic issues, such as marriage or what's best for the family, these types of things. You're not going to see a lot of that stuff. I hope we see a lot of that. I don't want to be pessimistic. I'm hopeful that the gospel will move forward, will always move forward, and is moving forward, and disciples are being made. The Spirit of God is restoring lives and reconciling all things to Christ. But the patterns of history is that when we live in a culture where the elites have turned their back on God, it's only a matter of time before those elites and that culture turns its guns on the Christians. And I think that's something for us to reckon with. And really what I've been trying to show you, for those of you that are at Hope City, what I've been trying to show you is that Pharaoh was a real person, but Pharaoh is also an archetype. He's a kind of Satan. So he's opposing God's people. He opposes God, and he is in destroying the children, for example. He commands the midwives to kill the baby boys, and then gets frustrated that they don't do it. And he commands, he just says, hey, any Egyptian, Egyptians, kill the firstborn of the Israelites. You have this Pharaoh who opposes God's people. He's a liar. He's a murderer, seeking to kill and destroy. I mean, this is Satan prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So behind a culture that is hostile to Christians in the church is Satan. So Jesus said in the Gospel of John that Satan is the ruler of the world. He's the ruler of this world. So what he means by that is the ruler, the one who animates just the worldly stuff of living life in a fallen world. So Christ is, of course, the ruler over the universe. He's the rightful king. But for the time being, until he comes back again, Satan is left to deceive and to manipulate, to gaslight, and to steer cultures and movements in a direction that opposes God and God's people. So that's what's behind all of this is demonic influence. So in our own day and age is the same thing. In America, when our politicians or our media, culture, whatever it is, even in Clinton, if the church is resisted and God's people are resisted because God's people are simply just standing on truth, that behind that is a demonic motivation. Behind that is an animating force that we would call the kingdom of darkness, and we see that in the book of Exodus. So there's just a lot there. There's a lot to process with that, and that's something I've been chewing on, is just the nature, the spiritual nature of life, and how there's a spiritual battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, and that will really come to the forefront in the book of Exodus, especially during the plagues. So spoiler alert, if you're a member of Hope City Church, the plagues correspond with Egyptian idolatry, with Egyptian polytheism. Like each plague has some sort of dimension where where God turns the Nile to blood, and God sends frogs and locusts. Like each one of those plagues corresponds with the god of the Nile, or the god of symbols with frogs. So it's a polemic. It's like Yahweh, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Moses. Our God is the God, and these other false gods that the cultures such as ancient Egypt worship are demons. And God is basically dropping a bow from the top rope on these demons, and he's demonstrating to everybody that he is the true God, he's the creator, and he's more powerful than anybody. So that's one of the more interesting things in the book of Exodus. So that's kind of what I've been chewing on with preaching. And then just to shift over to some of the things that are sticking out to me in terms of teaching and my time prepping for tutoring. My kids are in a homeschool group that has a classical curriculum, and one of the parts of that is they emphasize grammar. And grammar essentially is the parts of any discipline. Like woodworking has a grammar. There's names for tools, and they perform certain functions, and we have to know how those, what is the difference between a plane and a planer? What is the difference between a marking gauge and a mortising gauge? There's all these names for things, and there's a reason there's different names for things, and they work differently. So everything has a grammar, but language has a grammar, of course. So grammar, we need to know like what letters mean. I'm trying to teach my preschooler, 5-year-old who's shifting into kindergarten, still trying to work on letter sounds, letter names, numbers. And all of those things are just components of grammar. And so a classical education lays a heavy emphasis on learning grammar in the younger years and building upon that with tougher and tougher concepts and tougher content. Like reading amazing works of literature requires a disciplined knowledge of grammar. And one of the ways that this curriculum that our kids are in tries to teach grammar is through the study of Latin. So I've had to, because I'm tutoring in our group, I stepped in because the previous tutor, he changed jobs and he was no longer able to fit it into his schedule to tutor these high school boys. But essentially, I'm putting my kids in this homeschool group that's dealing with Latin, and I'm trying to learn all these new things. What is a classical curriculum? I'm way in over my head. And then this would be our third year doing this curriculum. But the second year, parents were like, hey, we need a tutor for these 15-year-old boys. And I'm like, okay, cool, I can do that. As a pastor, I can flex my schedule. And so on Fridays, I tutor. And one of the things was Latin. It's like teaching these 15-year-old boys helping them, tutoring them in their Latin studies. And Latin is incredibly difficult for me because I don't know Latin. Studying foreign languages has always been tough for me. I don't know why. It's just been difficult. I took 4 years of French in high school, and I'd hardly know any French. It's just I don't have that mind for whatever reason that remembers all of those little parts and rules of grammar. As my mom would know, I'm not a great speller, and these part of it's just my memory. I don't know what it is, but foreign languages has not come easy to me. So I'm thrown into this situation where I'm tutoring these kids, and we're doing Latin, and it's forced me to make a decision. I either am going to be helpful to these boys, and or I'm either going to be helpful to them, or I'm not. I'm just going to be some chaperone that is like, sure, yeah. What's the answer key say? On Fridays we get together for 6 hours and we go through each subject in their curriculum, and I help lead this discussion. They call it seminar days. But in order to help them with the Latin subject, it requires me to know something about Latin. Even though I'm not their teacher, their parents are their teachers. I still have to know something about the subject of Latin. And this sent me down a huge rabbit trail of trying to understand not only Latin, but teaching in general. I'm not really teaching in our homeschool co-op as a tutor. I'm more facilitating discussion. That's what the model is. But there's elements of teaching. I mean, I'm 36 years old, and these boys, I'm 20 years older than these boys. And so there are some things that I should be teaching them. I should be imparting experience to them. But teaching something you don't know is impossible. And I actually have this book that was recommended to me called The 7 Laws of Teaching, or 7 Laws of Learning. I can't remember. I think it's 7 Laws of Teaching. And it's written by, who is it? John Milton Gregory. I think he's an old Baptist guy that started Illinois State, some college in Illinois. And he wrote this book on the 7 laws of teaching. And the first law is that the teacher must know the subject they're teaching. And I don't know Latin. And so I'm like, what the heck's going to happen here? So the first year of tutoring, which was last year, the first year of tutoring these boys, especially the first month, I have no idea what I'm looking at. The Latin, it might as well be Egyptian. I mean, it uses the same alphabet, so it's not that extreme. But I didn't really know how things were working. I didn't know the patterns. I didn't know the rules of grammar, all that kind of stuff. And so this sent me down a rabbit trail, again, like I said, where I had to make a decision. I'm either going to be helpful to these kids or I'm not. And to be helpful, I had to study Latin, and I had to know Latin. And so I, for the last year, have been every morning, I've been reading, going through a Latin curriculum. And I've been reading and studying the grammar rules, studying the vocab, and about half hour a day. I go in and I study Latin. And one of the things, let me just say this. People always ask, what's the purpose of learning an old, dead language like Latin? It's not like I'm going to go to the grocery store. I'm not going to go to Quick Star here in Clinton and use Latin to order, my donuts. That's not what's going to happen. I'm not even probably going to travel anywhere that has spoke Latin. I'd love to go to Rome. It'd be kind of cool to be able to read signs that are written in Latin, but that's probably not going to happen. So what's the point of learning Latin? And that's a fair question. What's the point? Because it's a ton of work. Getting these kids into a place where they're learning, or getting these kids to where they're proficient and knowledgeable in Latin is there's a lot of work involved with that. So it does beg the question, why do we need to learn Latin? One of the answers to that question that I've found just through my own personal experience is that Latin forces you to become a master of the English language. So what I've found is in learning Latin, it forced me to go back to my English grammar and mechanics that I was weak in. So I'm learning, I got a stack of flashcards that I go through as part of my Latin work every day. And those flashcards, some of them are English grammar rules, parts of the sentence, things like that. Because in Latin, they're like, all right, we're going to study Latin adjectives. And then I'm like, okay, I need to know what an adjective is. And they're like, okay, we're going to study verbs. And I'm like, okay, I need to know verbs. What is an adverb, an adjective, a verb? What are the verb moods? What are verb tenses? What is the difference between the passive voice and the active voice? What's a transitive verb and an intransitive verb? These are all things that in the Latin curriculum, they just assume you know. And so I'm like, I don't remember all these things, and be totally honest. So I had to go back and I had to learn those things. And because Latin is a new language, it's fresh to me. And what it forces me to do is like I'm looking at it with these fresh eyes, and it's forcing me to really, it's like I'm seeing things for the first time, and it's forcing me to see things for the first time in my own native tongue that I've just took for granted. So anyways, there's more that could be said, and people have said it more eloquently than me. I'm by no means the master in Latin. Still have a ton to learn, but I will say for me, my own personal, the personal benefit that I've had so far from learning Latin is that it's helped me with my English grammar and mechanics. It's been very good for that. And it's actually made me a better preacher, I believe, because now when I'm opening up into the text of Scripture obviously is words and sentences. And so because I'm able to better identify things like verb moods and tenses, I'm able to read a verse of Scripture and understand, more quickly identify what the subject of that sentence is, the subject of that verse, and what's the direct object, what's the predicate, what is being said of the subject. These types of things have become valuable to me. I'm like, oh, cool. I have a better understanding of what Paul is actually really trying to say here in his big old run-on sentences with all the prepositional phrases and all the commas and all that kind of stuff. So that's Latin's helped me in that. So I'll stop with that. There's a ton more that I have to read this year, and this is actually the first week of tutoring and teaching. School starting back up for these kids, and I'm gonna be forced to read a lot of things that I don't know a lot about, and such as Shakespeare. This year has a unit on Shakespeare and poetry. And these are things that I remember kind of touching and dabbling in high school, but not much. So this year I'm gonna be stretching myself again, and I think that's good. It's a good thing. It's forcing me to learn, and in some ways it's redeeming my own education. And I think that is one value of homeschooling that other forms of education don't have, is homeschooling forces the parent to really learn alongside the student. It forces the parent to basically go back to school. And that's what it's been for me, is I've gone back to school, and it's been good for me. All right, let's shift to the tool of the week. So for those of you that can see the video, this is a hand plane. It's the Stanley Bailey number 4 hand plane. And it's one of my favorite tools that I own. And let me just say this: if you're someone that's ever used the word plane or planer, I need you to know I'm not going to scold you for this, but I think you need to be corrected gently. Is that when you're talking about a hand tool, this is not a planer. This is a plane. And if you're planing with this plane, you're the planer. So if I'm planing wood with this hand plane, I'm the planer. A big machine that planes mechanically, that's a planer. So that's probably why people use the word planer when they're describing a hand plane, but that's not accurate. So this is a hand plane, and it was manufactured, I don't know, sometime in the late 1800s. There's a website that you can look up, like what the age of these hand tools, like the number 4 Stanley hand planes. There's a website that will take you through identifying what the age of the plane is. And I did that with this one. And one of the things that I found was that it's either a Type 3 or a Type 4. And that means that this hand plane was manufactured in the late 1800s. So this hand plane is essentially as old as my house. And my house is, 140 years old, nearly 140 years old. So this hand plane really is incredible. Like 140 years old is, what would that be? 5 generations of craftsmen, probably 5 generations of craftsmen. And you can tell, like, I don't know if you could see this in the camera, but there's a split here in the wood and the handle. And you can tell it's been repaired. Some glue, dried glue on that joint. And there's a nice patina on this whole tool, but especially on the back handle. You can tell that it's been gripped many times by many hands. And over a long period of time, it's been used. So this tool's got dents on it. One of the things that I love about old hand tools, especially old hand planes, is that the edges on the tool here are filed down. So if you were to pick up this hand plane, you would feel that there's no sharp edges on the metal. It would feel very good to your hands. If you were to pick up a modern tool, they don't really, some companies make modern hand planes, but in general, they don't make these kinds of planes anymore. But if you were to pick up like a modern chisel or something, anything that is modern metal tool, you're going to find some sharp edges because they just cast it in the factory, they cut it out, and bam, they grind up the edge, rough ground, sharp edge, and then they just put it in the package and they send it to you. And when you hold it, it's just like it doesn't feel good in your hands because the plastic is so fake feeling and the metal edges are so sharp and rough. Well, these old craftsmen, they would get these tools and they would literally take a file and they would go down all of the edges of this tool. Because think about it, you're going to spend 8 hours a day, especially with this tool. You're going to spend most of your working life holding this tool. You're going to want it to feel good on your hands. So that's one way I can always tell when I go to a thrift shop or an antique store or something and I find these old hand planes. It's one way I can always tell which ones have really been used and the age of them is if they feel good in my hand and the edges are all round down, then it's generally a good indicator that this was a working hand plane for an old craftsman. Now, what else do I like about this tool? This one in particular, I think this one is maybe this isn't the Toffman one. I have one that is etched. Sometimes the makers etch their names in them, but I don't think this is the one. I have that one downstairs in my shop. But this one, let me just tell you what this does. This is a number 4 smoothing plane. And what this does is it's basically your go-to hand plane if you're a woodworker and you need the surface of a board smoothed. So it's not something that you would use to necessarily join pieces of wood, long pieces of wood. Those are the joiner planes. It's something that you would use if you wanted to get the rough cuts and scrapes and scratches, tool marks from other tools off of the board, and just make it like a glassy, perfectly smooth spot, perfectly smooth section of your wood. Like you would use this hand plane. And for people that are making like drawers and small cabinets and things like that, this is really the plane that you would use for almost all of your work. I follow a guy named Paul Sellers, and he uses the Stanley number 4 hand plane for almost everything he does. Like whether he's rounding over an edge, planing end grain smooth, even squaring up a board so that the sides and the front and back of the board, like top and bottom, everything is 4 square, everything's right angle. Like he will prepare stock with this hand plane, and I think it's incredible. So this, favorite tool, probably this might be my favorite tool just in general, is the Stanley Bailey number 4 hand plane. It's a joy to work with, and that's what I love about hand tools. They're just fun to be able to use, and they're so tactile. They engage your whole body. It requires your whole body engagement. You can hear it working. You know, if you've ever heard and seen someone use a hand plane, there's that nice shh, shh, shh noise, and then there's those perfectly curly Q shavings. It's beautiful. In fact, I have a book called My Father's Toolbox, I think is what it's called, and I read it to my son. He's a year old, John, and I read it to him, and he loves that. And there's these little curly cues that it says that, you know, this was in my father's toolbox. It's the hand plane, and it makes curly Q shavings. And I always point it out, and he thinks it's hilarious. And so that's it. I just the love of learning, the love of hand tools, the love of the Lord. That's something that I'm just trying to share with you, and hopefully it inspires you to love the Lord and love God's world. And before I hop off here, I'll just tell you, my goal is to do this kind of thing once a week. There's probably going to be some weeks where I'm busy with other things, but once a week I'm going to try to get up into my attic in the early morning and just talk about what I'm learning and what I'm passionate about with my work as a pastor. And that's why it's called the Pastor's Sawdust, because as I'm sawing on my material, the sawdust falls off, and it's just come fragments and things that I find interesting, and I'm just trying to show to you. And hopefully it has been encouraging to you in your walk with Jesus and your love for the world that Jesus made.